with this. The keys in here, too.
When a wealthy family is murdered in their home, it looks like a professional hit, until investigators begin to suspect it was really the work of a gifted amateur. The investigation into the drowning death of a woman in Pennsylvania sends ripples out as far as North Carolina, where some dark secrets begin to surface. Detectives on the case of a murdered woman get more than they bargained for when they uncover a sinister family business. Every family has its problems. Every household has its secrets. But when the skeletons in the closet are real, forensics is called upon to get to the bottom of those family plots. On Easter Sunday, 1992, the Ewell family was wrapping up a weekend getaway at their beach house. Dana, a 20-year-old college student, bade farewell to his older sister Tiffany and his parents, Dale and Glee. Dana stayed behind to spend the evening with his girlfriend's family, while the others made the 200-mile trek back to Fresno.
See you home. Have a nice flight.
It was the last time Dana would see them alive. 2 days later, when he couldn't get his family on the phone, Dana called a neighbor to check on the house. The neighbor, accompanied by the Ewell's housekeeper, made a gruesome discovery. Mr. Ewell lay dead on the floor. He appeared to have been shot in the back of the head. As investigators from the Fresno County Sheriff's Department searched the house, they realized that Dale wasn't the only victim. His daughter Tiffany and his wife Glee were also found dead. Like her father, Tiffany had been killed execution style, ambushed with a single bullet to the back of the head. But Glee had known what was coming. It seemed that she had tried to run before bullets to the back and shoulder stopped her. The gunpowder residue on her sweatshirt told investigators that the killer had then fired into her body at close range. Based on the condition of the victims, investigators knew that the Ewells must have been killed almost immediately after they returned from the beach 2 days earlier. 5 spent slugs were collected from the crime scene. 1 more was found in Glee's body. In the master bedroom, investigators found an opened box of 9mm ammunition and an empty gun case. The owner's manual showed that the missing weapon was a Browning 9mm pistol. Since much of the house was ransacked, detectives first theorized that this was a burglary attempt gone awry. But the evidence didn't support that theory.
No, looks like an amateur job.
There was no forced entry. Many valuable items, including Dale Ewell's gun collection, were left in the home. Rather than use pillowcases to collect the loot, bed sheets were laid out and loaded up with worthless items like audio cassettes and coins. To homicide detective John Souza, even though the killers slipped in and out without notice, it just didn't look like a professional burglary.
A good burglar searches dressers and stuff by starting from the bottom and going up. That way he has never have to close a drawer. He opens the bottom one, he searches it, he opens the next one, and they all stay open. Where here was a combination of everything. There was no pattern at all.
The crime had been planned out to a T. Though many neighbors were in their backyards on Easter Sunday, no one noticed anything strange at the Ewell house, nor had they heard gunshots. Given the amount of forethought that must have gone into the murders, detectives could not discount a professional hit. nor could they overlook the prospect that someone might be coming back to finish off the sole family survivor, Dana Ewell.
Glad to have you in here.
He returned from school and met with investigators. If he feared for his life, he was hiding it, along with his grief.
Really appreciate that.
He's been just told that his family is dead, all his family. There's not a tear. And it just amazed me. I'm going, well, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he's in shock.
He told police that his mother had once worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. His father, who owned an airplane dealership, had a reputation as a ruthless businessman. As Dale's $8 million fortune grew over the years, it seemed likely that he'd made some enemies. Investigators delved into the family's personal and financial background, probing for dark secrets. None were found. Glee's history as a translator with the CIA was uneventful, and though many people seem to have disliked Dale Ewell, none had a motive to kill him and his family.
What's this?
Our lab technician.
Dana was asked to inspect the house, keeping an eye out for anything missing.
Blood that was. As you can see, the blood stains here. We're not sure whose blood that was.
Detectives noticed that he seemed unaffected by the blood-stained carpet. But he became indignant when he saw that investigators had damaged a light fixture.
What happened here? Did your people do this?
Immediately after the funeral, he started spending money. He lavished his girlfriend with expensive gifts and purchased a $130,000 plane for himself. It was suspicious behavior, but Dana had an alibi. During the murder, he said, he'd been 4 hours away with his girlfriend's family. The girl's father, an FBI agent, confirmed it.
If you could take
Dana stood to gain millions of dollars from his family's death, but his perfect alibi meant that he couldn't have been the shooter. Detectives hoped that forensics would help find out who was. But there was little to go on. No footprints or fingerprints. Even the shells had been removed. The only physical evidence was the 6 9mm bullets expended at the crime scene. All hope of solving the case rested in the hands of ballistics experts at the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. The crime lab determined that the bullets had come from the box of ammunition found in the victim's nightstand. Identical scratch patterns told investigators that all 6 bullets had been fired through the same barrel. But when these marks were compared with ones from a Browning pistol like the one stolen from the Ewell's house, investigators found an obvious discrepancy. The scratches that indicate rate of twist didn't match. Rate of twist is the distance it takes a bullet to complete a single rotation. The Browning has a rate of twist of 10 inches, but the murder bullets showed a 12-inch rate of twist. For criminalist Alan Boudreau, there was no mistaking the findings.
To me, that finished the issue. It's not a Browning pistol that fired the murder bullets.
But these weren't the only marks on the slugs. Each of the 6 bullets bore deep scratches. Boudreau was puzzled by these peculiar marks.
I'd never really seen anything like that before, although I had about 24, 25 years experience.
Enlargements of the bullet markings were sent to law enforcement labs throughout the country, but none was familiar with the etchings or the unusual rate of twist. 6 bullets had been fired, yet no one had heard shots. Unusual gun barrel marks had etched a mysterious signature onto the resulting slugs. This suggested that the weapon had been modified, perhaps by a silencer. But the Sheriff's Department had little experience with them.
I've never come across where someone had used a silencer. Silencers are not, I mean, they're used and you see them on TV a lot, but I think it's more movie drama than actually in real life. Silencers are not not used in crimes. And so that was kind of unusual in itself.
Before, Souza had only theorized that murder was the motivation. If a silencer had been used, he now had the physical proof.
You got a silencer, you got a killer that came to the house to kill people. That was the sole purpose.
After their ballistics analysis, investigators studied the microscopic residue from Glee's sweatshirt. It's common to find gunmetal residue near close-range shots, but this one contained an unusual mix of rubber, steel wool, and bright yellow fibers. The forensics team couldn't identify the source of these materials, but knew that they had somehow been used to modify the weapon. Their findings corroborated the silencer theory. They proved that on Easter night, someone had entered the Ewell home with a deadly agenda. He ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary and stole the victim's gun to throw detectives off track. But he had used ammunition he found in the home. And that meant the killer would have had to know there was a box of 9mm ammunition stashed in Dale Ewell's nightstand. Only a handful of people had intimate knowledge of the house, and 3 of them were dead. Detectives probed more deeply into Dana's background. College classmates at Santa Clara described him as a preppy, clean-cut loner, obsessed with wealth. So it was odd, they thought, that he'd been best friends with a student named Joel Radovsich, who was nearly kicked out of school for stealing furniture. Joel seemed defensive with investigators. He told them that he barely knew Dana. His whereabouts on Easter Sunday could not be confirmed.
Look, I already told y'all I know. I don't know anything about it.
Surveillance on Dana showed that Joel moved into the Ewell home 2 months after the murders and lived there until the following October. During that time, Dana paid his friends bills and treated him to thousands of dollars worth of helicopter lessons. Yet when Dana was asked about Joel, he denied knowing him. Detectives had caught both young men in a bald-faced lie. They needed to find out what else they might be lying about. More than a year after the triple homicide of a wealthy Fresno family, detectives still didn't have enough evidence to prove that Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsich were involved. And the pair was well aware of that fact. When Dana returned to Santa Clara the following spring, they communicated only through beepers and payphones. Dana was skilled at dodging the detectives.
Dana was always looking over his shoulder, very cautious. He would go to the Jet Center in San Jose Airport, and they had insulated booths, payphone booths. And most of the calls were from those. And you couldn't even stand outside the booth and hear what was being said.
Joel wasn't as careful. He was overheard telling Dana that he was worried about what the investigators might have on them. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to tie the young men to the murders. Investigators obtained a search warrant for a duplicate beeper so that they could monitor Joel's pages. Weeks passed without any suspicious calls.
Find out who it is.
Then, in October 1993, Joel got a page from a man detectives knew very little about. His name was Jack Ponce.
Okay, there it is.
He and Joel used to go target shooting together. Ponce admitted that just 11 days before the Ewell murders, he had purchased a Feather Industries 9mm semi-automatic rifle. He said he bought it to kill opossums. Detectives thought that was an odd choice of weapon, and when they asked to see it, Ponce said that the gun had been stolen. If investigators could somehow tie the missing rifle to the bullets and residue from the crime scene, they'd be able to connect Radovsich and Ewell to the triple homicide. Ponce, realizing he was implicated in the murders, turned state's evidence.
The magazine for it.
He admitted that he'd purchased the rifle for Joel. Days later, Joel told Ponce he'd killed the Ewells and asked him to dispose of the weapon. Ponce threw it away. The murder weapon was gone, but another piece of the puzzle fell into place when investigators learned that Dana had purchased a book on how to build a homemade silencer.
I purchased the same books that he had purchased, and brought them home, and of course I gave them to Alan Boudreau and says, make a silencer per this book.
Boudreau built a silencer to the book's specifications. Among the materials were tennis balls and steel wool, consistent with the residue found on Glee Ewell's sweatshirt. But the real proof was in the firing. For that, they'd need the gun. After interviewing 90 firearms manufacturers worldwide, investigators discovered that the rare Feather Industries rifle is the only 9mm manufactured with a 12-inch rate of twist. Even though he didn't have Ponce's rifle, Boudreau could still perform tests on other weapons of the same model. He spent months tracking down 9mm Feathers with serial numbers close to the one registered to Ponce. The barrels of these guns would be nearly identical. Boudreau test-fired the weapons through sticky paper to trap any microscopic particles blown through the barrel. This trace evidence was compared to the residue found on Glee Ewell's clothing. The unusual yellow fibers, the rubber particles, and the steel wool were an exact match.
And it was not difficult to reasonably conclude, yes, there is tennis ball material on Mrs. Ewell's sweatshirt, and it's consistent with the silencer that I constructed based on the information from Detective Souza.
The test bullets closely matched the characteristics of the murder bullets. The rate of twist was correct. The deep scratches were nearly identical to the murder bullets. And finally, the gun extruded the same residue as was found near Glee Ewell. No other type of weapon could have matched so closely. In March 1995, nearly 2 years after the murders, arrest warrants were obtained for Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsich.
All right, here's the plan.
Based on their extensive investigation, detectives had finally pieced together the whole story. Hungry for his father's fortune, Dana conspired with Joel a year in advance to shoot his family and make it look like a burglary. In exchange, Dana would split the $8 million inheritance with him. While Dana established his perfect alibi 200 miles away, Joel slipped into the Ewell home with a spare key. He shot Dana's sister and mother first, then waited for Dale. They'd figured that without the weapon, they couldn't be tied to the murders. But as cleverly as they'd planned, Dana and Joel's designs weren't bulletproof. Neither man ever confessed. In May of 1998, Ewell and Radovsich were found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. In the Ewell case, creeping suspicions undermined a tight-lipped conspiracy. Elsewhere, a murder investigation was triggered by an innocent comment.
Allegheny County 911, what's your
On November 7th, 1994, police in Pennsylvania responded to a 911 call from a distraught man named Timothy Boskowski.
Calm down, sir. Calm down. What's your address? Lee, we got a detail in Ross Township. It's a white female found in a hot tub.
His wife, Mary Ann, had lost consciousness in the hot tub. He couldn't resuscitate her. Police arrived to see paramedics attempting to revive her.
What happened this evening?
Their efforts failed.
Is she gonna be okay? What? I was inside, she was out here in the hot tub, and I saw her, and I just...
Her heart stopped as she was rushed to the hospital. The 35-year-old woman was pronounced dead on arrival. She had a .22 concentration of alcohol in her bloodstream.
I'm sure you did, man. I do appreciate it.
More than twice the legal limit for intoxication.
Were you aware that my wife drank?
Boskowski told the nurse that Mary Ann had been a heavy drinker and that he blamed the drowning on her alcoholism.
Down some, and she just wouldn't.
You got it?
In Allegheny County, cases of accidental death are police matters, so technicians processed the scene. Investigators questioned Boskowski's parents, who'd been called over to babysit while Timothy was at the hospital.
Okay, well, it's a shock. It's really a shock.
Boskowski's father made the comment that this wasn't the first time their son had endured such a tragedy. His first wife, Elaine, had died 4 years earlier, nearly to the day. When Boskowski returned from the hospital, investigators were waiting for him. Boskowski described the incident. Throughout the day and into the evening, he estimated that Mary Ann drank between 13 and 15 cans of beer. Around 11:30 that night, the couple downed a bottle of wine. Mary Ann was an alcoholic, her husband said. Boskowski claimed that Mary Ann stayed in the hot tub after he got out. When he next saw her, he said, she was lying on her side in the water. Detectives searched the house. They found beer in the refrigerator and a bin of empty cans. But these cans were completely dry inside and had obviously been collected over several days. Cans that had been opened that evening would have still held some liquid. The evidence contradicted Boskowski's claim that Mary Ann had consumed beer after beer well into the evening. They also learned that a friend of Mary Ann's had spoken to her on the telephone for an hour and a half earlier that afternoon. The friend said that Mary Ann didn't seem drunk. The more detectives learned, the more they suspected that Mrs. Boskowski's death was no accident, but a case of deadly déjà vu. If Mary Ann Boskowski was murdered in her hot tub, detectives in Pennsylvania had very little physical evidence to prove it. There was no sign of violence found in or around the tub. All they really had were some conflicting statements. Timothy Boskowski agreed to go down to the police station for further questioning. To Detective Jimmy Svettig, his exacting account seemed staged.
One of the things, he was so consistent with his times, too consistent. 10 to 1, I did this. Mary Ann did this at 8 minutes to 1. 5 after 1, I was putting on my shoes.
In this interview with you this afternoon, is that okay? Yeah.
While Boskowski was relating his story, detectives observed a scratch on his neck.
Could you tell me how you got that?
My wife and I went on a cruise, and
They asked him to remove his shirt.
Take a look at that? Sure. We may even want to take a picture of it. Also, Colby, would
On
you,
his back, they saw a pattern of scratches.
Thank you.
Boskowski explained that he and Mary Ann had been on a cruise recently. While in the tub, he had asked her to scratch his sunburned back. Given the suspect's pale skin and the deep gouges, the explanation seemed implausible.
Okay, that's some scratches there, Tim.
These looked like marks from a struggle. When investigators questioned Boskowski about his first wife, his demeanor drastically changed.
Married prior to this lady, is that true?
No, I'd rather not discuss that at all, if that's all right.
He cut the interview short and demanded a lawyer. Without enough information to detain him, he was free to go. Investigators immediately contacted law enforcement in Greensboro, North Carolina, where Boskowski and his first wife had lived. They uncovered some uncanny similarities between the two Mrs. Boskowskis. Boskowski had met both wives, Mary Ann and Elaine, in church singles groups.
Okay, you looked at this already?
Yeah, I looked at it.
All right.
I thought she was.
Yeah, she
Both worked as religious school teachers.
Yeah.
They were the exact same weight.
We had such a good time.
Even more chilling were the similarities between their deaths. According to North Carolina police, Boskowski had called 911 on a Sunday night in November, just as he had done in Pennsylvania. Paramedics arrived to find Elaine on the bathroom floor with her husband attempting CPR.
Okay, so we're...
Can I ask you a few questions about what happened last night?
Sure.
Boskowski claimed that his wife had been drinking heavily that evening, fell unconscious in the tub, and drowned.
Do you know where? Okay, you were listening to music. Was that on a tape?
Though detectives in North Carolina were suspicious, they didn't have enough evidence to disprove the husband's account.
So you performed CPR?
Cause of death was left blank on the death certificate. Boskowski was never charged.
I tried to get her to stop, but I mean,
Now, 4 years later, detectives in Pennsylvania were faced with the possibility that their case would end the same way.
To bring it to trial, you need more than just suspicion. You need a case. You got to put the evidence together, and everything has to be there. And they just didn't have what they needed.
Though the bizarre circumstances of his wife's drowning deaths pointed to foul play, it would be a challenge for investigators in Pennsylvania to differentiate an accident from a murder, especially when there were no witnesses. Unless Mary Ann's body had a compelling story to tell, Boskowski would have just washed his hands of another suspicious death. The autopsy began with an inspection of the body. There was no evidence of external trauma, just a few fresh bruises. But the bruising wasn't enough to disprove Boskowski's story. The paramedics might have caused them. The body was next examined for signs of drowning. To Allegheny County Coroner Cyril Wecht, it was evident that something had cut off Mary Ann's breathing, but it wasn't water.
These lungs were not wet and heavy at all, and if she had drowned in this tub, I believe that there certainly would have been a fair amount of water into the lungs.
The victim had sustained hemorrhages in her eye and the back of her tongue. The muscle tissue of her neck had sustained deep bruising. All of these were telltale signs of death by strangulation. The coroner concluded that after a rough struggle, someone had wrapped his hands around the victim's neck and squeezed the life out of her. The findings in Pennsylvania caught the attention of John Butts, Chief Medical Examiner of North Carolina. He wondered if Boskowski's first wife, Elaine, had also been asphyxiated 4 years earlier. The autopsy reports showed no indication that she was, but the original examiner might have missed the telltale signs, enabling Boskowski to get away with murder. Elaine's body had been long buried, but photographs remained. Investigators hoped they'd be enough to rectify a grave oversight. 4 years after Elaine Boskowski died in her bathroom, investigators in North Carolina finally had their chance to prove that she'd been murdered. Medical examiner John Butts noticed a strange mark on one of the photographs taken at her autopsy.
One of the important pieces in the puzzle of this case involves some distinctive bruises that were present on Ms. Buskowski's lower chest, upper abdominal region. This was that set of linear or elongated bruises that are illustrated in this photograph.
These parallel bruises, called railroad tracks, match the shower door railing in the Buskowskis' bathroom. At autopsy, their significance was overlooked. But knowing how Timothy Buskowski had allegedly killed his second wife helped Butts find clues to the death of his first one. She was literally squeezed to death.
This bruise was produced when this woman's abdomen, upper chest region was pushed or compressed down onto the shower track. And again, it was our feeling or our conclusion that that's actually the mechanism of her death.
Based on what North Carolina investigators had turned up, detectives in Pennsylvania looked for more similarities between the two cases. They learned that both of Buskowski's wives were planning to leave the marriage. Neither had yet canceled their life insurance policies that named their husband as beneficiary. It seemed Buskowski felt that killing his wife would solve his financial and romantic problems. When history began to repeat itself with Mary Ann, he resorted to a plan that worked in the past. Thanks to the astute work of investigators in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the staged drowning of his second wife would be Buskowski's last. In 1996, he was convicted of the murder of Elaine. In 1999, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Ann. Timothy Buskowski's murderous past eventually caught up with him. In New Jersey, police again would have to look backward to solve a death in the family. Early Saturday, March 4th, 1995, a jogger was having a run through East Side Park while most of Paterson, New Jersey still slept. One of its residents had apparently chosen to sleep practically on the jogging path.
Hey, buddy, you all right?
Only a pair of feet stuck out of the sleeping bag. The jogger wondered how the person could breathe and realized the occupant wasn't breathing at all. Police confirmed that the body in the bag was deceased. They interviewed the jogger and fanned out to look for evidence of a possible homicide. The victim was a young female, 18 to 24. She'd been beaten. The sleeping bag interior was blood-stained, but not soap, suggesting she was stuffed into it afterward, probably to move her to this spot. Detective Mike Cassari led the investigation.
We knew it was a murder. We knew that wasn't the original scene. It was just that we were trying to figure out who did it, and that's where the whole thing started.
Most every homicide investigation begins with the victim. In this case, she had no identity. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner found no sign of sexual assault. The blood-stained portions of her clothes were carefully cut away, and the blood tested against the victim's own. If some of it didn't match, investigators hoped that it could be used against a suspected culprit. But all the stains matched the victim's blood. They found neither hide nor hair of any potential suspect. At the New Jersey State Identification Bureau, the victim's fingerprints were run through AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. It compares prints from police files all over the country. Within hours, it found a match right in New Jersey. The victim was 18-year-old Tara Carter. Her prints were on file because she had once been arrested for shoplifting. Her parents had moved out of state. but police found her closest relative, her sister. They brought a photo of the victim.
See if you see anybody you recognize.
A friend came to help because she couldn't bring herself to look at it.
Yeah, I recognize her.
They made the ID. Now there was no doubt.
You sure?
Tara Carter was dead. Police learned that Tara said she was going to spend the weekend with her boyfriend. He went by the name Original. She didn't know his real name or where to find him. She also said that Tara had been living with a family friend, a widow named Celestine Payne, and her children. They might know more. Payne lived in a nearby neighborhood where she occasionally rented rooms in her house. Police paid her a visit. Celestine offered to help in any way that she could.
She directed us to the bedroom area where Tara slept with her two daughters. And myself and Detective Reyes looked around. You know, it's common to look for phone books or anything with possible, you know, names of friends or anything, because we had nothing. We didn't have anything to go on to solve this crime at that point.
Oh, no. Wendy, you can't take that.
Tara Carter was treated like a member of Payne's family. She was the best friend of Celestine's daughter, Wendy, with whom she shared the room until Wendy moved to South Carolina. Detectives looked in the closet where Tara kept her belongings.
That's all I know.
They found nothing to indicate she was in any kind of trouble with her mysterious boyfriend or with anyone else. When Payne could offer no new information about the victim's boyfriend, Original, police put the word out that they needed to speak with him. In the meantime, they looked for more information about the victim. Payne directed them to the basement, where more of Tara's things were stored.
You know, I think Tara told me. I recall, yeah.
They didn't know what they were looking for until they found it. In one area, drops of blood dotted the basement floor.
Detective Reyes automatically told Miss Payne not to touch anything, you know, that it's possible that the crime happened here. And she again said, well, if it happened here, I want to know about it. This is my house.
See these drops right here?
The amount and position of the blood droplets raised suspicions, but didn't suggest that this was the murder scene. Investigators weren't sure what the drops meant.
And you could see a dripping stain coming down from the rafter. Directly below it was a stain of blood, which indicated that it's possible blood may have dripped from the upstairs into the basement.
You need to go back upstairs and look there.
Celestine Payne gave her consent to a more thorough search of her house.
She said, I want to know about it. Whatever it takes to figure out, you guys do what you got to do.
While the forensics team was dispatched, detectives continued their investigation. They headed back to the victim's closet, which turned out to be directly over the blood-stained beams. They found blood on the wall and floor of the closet, along with blood-stained women's underwear and other garments. It looked like bloody murder, but investigators had to be sure.
Can you hand me the plumber, please?
Samples were collected and sent to the New Jersey State Police Central Lab, where genetic markers in the blood were scrutinized. These proteins, inherited from our parents, don't change. Though not as precise as DNA testing, genetic marker testing is often sufficient because certain markers are more rare than others. Senior forensic scientist Cynthia McSweeney analyzed the samples from the closet.
And I was able to determine that this blood stain was consistent with only 3% of the black population.
That 3% included the victim, Tara Carter. The evidence proved that she had met her death inside the house.
Well, we just got a few questions.
Celestine Payne accompanied detectives to the station for questioning. She told them that she last saw the victim at 11 a.m. on Friday, March 3rd, the day before her body was found. Tara said she was going to run errands. Celestine and her son had errands of their own to run and were gone most of the day.
How did he get out in the backyard?
When Celestine returned, a man named Charlie Pincham was waiting on the porch. Pincham used to date Celestine's daughter, Wendy, before she moved away. And he was in the habit of stopping by Celestine's house and hanging out. She didn't know where he lived. Because he might have committed the crime while the Paynes were away, Charlie Pincham's name was added to the suspects list. While Celestine answered questions, investigators combed her house for more clues. Besides the bedroom closet, traces of blood were found in the kitchen. The drain pipes were removed and the traps emptied to see what might have accumulated there.
Almost 100 articles of evidence from there, including blood drippings, swabbings. Took the sink apart and removed, later turned out to be skull fragments inside the sink trap, the toilet. There was some hair and matter found inside there. From there, the whole thing exploded. The investigation took off.
By now, the victim's boyfriend, Original, heard police were looking for him and presented himself, along with an alibi. He was off the suspects list, at least for now. That left the equally mysterious Charlie Pincham and the grieving Celestine Payne. But detectives didn't know where Charlie Pincham was, and the forensic evidence didn't necessarily place Celestine Payne at the scene when the murder occurred. This wasn't the first time police had been to Payne's house. While reviewing the case, Detective Sergeant Ronald Humphrey remembered a prior incident.
There was a guy stabbed maybe about a year and a half before that, Eugene Cooper. I remember Eugene living there, but I never got to interview him. He was in intensive care unit at the hospital on a stab wound, and we couldn't get to speak to him.
Upon Cooper's release from the hospital, he refused to press charges and disappeared. Now, 18 months later, detectives tracked Eugene Cooper down to see if there was a connection. Cooper told them that while he lived in the house, Celestine wanted him to sign his life insurance policy over to her. He didn't do it, but let on that he had. Soon after, Charlie Pincham attacked him.
He said that at the time he got stabbed, Charlie was the one that stabbed him, and Celestine Payne that put him up to it.
Cooper didn't go to the police because he was frightened and wanted to put the whole ugly incident behind him. He picked out Pincham's photo from some mugshots. Because Cooper implicated him in this stabbing, it was more important than ever to locate him. Now that Eugene Cooper was talking, he had a lot more to say. And the case took another unexpected twist. He told police that Celestine had set several fires at her house for the insurance money. He also admitted that he helped Celestine move a body, but it wasn't the body of Tara Carter. Tara Carter had been found dead in a sleeping bag, and the investigation into her murder began to disclose other skeletons in Celestine Payne's closet.
Hey, honey.
According to Eugene Cooper, the death of Celestine's husband, Alfonso, years earlier, may not have been accidental. Prior to his death, Alfonso Payne had been suffering from severe hypertension and gout. He was being cared for by his wife, Celestine. In 1991, his body was found in a field across town. At the time, Alfonso's death was considered to be accidental, that he was doing drugs, wandered away, and collapsed. Now, 3.5 years later, Eugene Cooper told New Jersey police that he'd helped Celestine and her children dump Alfonso Payne's body on the other side of town. With Cooper's new information, detectives pulled Alfonso's medical records and autopsy report. They found that before his death, he had been too ill to even get out of bed, let alone get across town. The autopsy showed that the drugs in his system at the time of death weren't those prescribed for his medical condition, but high dosages of 5 kinds of tranquilizers and antidepressants, all prescribed for Celestine.
Hey, can you lift the bed up?
Yeah, sure.
Investigators had enough to get another search warrant for Payne's home. They found that besides the policy on her husband, Alfonso, and for fire damage, Payne also managed to get one on Eugene Cooper, even without his signature. It appeared that Celestine Payne may have killed her husband, and once again, insurance seemed to be the motive. They also found a policy on Tara Carter's life.
Looks like a couple of insurance.
This was strange because, like Cooper, she wasn't related to Payne. The policy provided a possible motive,
Eugene Cooper, I don't
but not enough evidence to arrest Celestine for murder.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while you're being questioned.
By this time, Charlie Pincham had been found and arrested for stabbing Eugene Cooper. Eventually, he admitted to it, saying that Celestine Payne put him up to it. Then, investigators asked him what he knew about the Tara Carter murder. He said he was there and tried to stop it, but Celestine Payne killed her. Afterward, he admitted helping her move the body, using a car she rented. They had what they needed to arrest Celestine Payne.
Put your hands behind your back.
Then they tracked down the rental car. Cynthia McSweeney tested the trunk for traces of blood and found nothing. But her job wasn't finished. Her tests of the liner below the trunk carpet yielded different results.
When I analyzed the liner and did get a positive result, I began to think that perhaps the person had tried to clean up the area but had not done a thorough job.
As before, a genetic marker analysis of the blood proved it belonged to the victim, Tara Carter. Its presence in the trunk of a car rented by Celestine Payne linked the suspect to the crime.
You've got a pretty good racket.
Despite the evidence, she flatly denied any wrongdoing.
I know he lied.
Like many women who kill, she hoped her charm could mask her guilt. Detective Michael Casari didn't buy it.
Celestine was a devious woman. She would look at you and say, "Child, I didn't do this murder," and almost melt into you. You know, I had nothing to do with this. I would never hurt anybody. And she's using her kids to kill people, including her own father. She's killing her friends. She's killing family people. She's evil. That's the only one word to put, an evil woman.
She passed that evil on to her daughter.
Oh, no, thank you.
Investigators learned that while Wendy pretended to be Tara's best friend, she also pretended to be Tara, at least long enough to sign a life insurance policy in Tara Carter's name.
Oh, yeah.
Once the policy was in effect, Tara Carter's days were numbered. The unwitting victim, lured into a false sense of security in Payne's home, was marked for death.
You look pretty.
It came quickly. Pincham admitted using a crowbar. Her body was stashed in the upstairs closet until it could be bundled and moved safely without being detected. Ultimately, the forensics clinched the case, and even Celestine Payne couldn't deny it. The bloodstains, the financial motive, and the opportunity all pointed to Payne, her daughter Wendy, and Charlie Pincham. When faced with the evidence, they plea bargained. Celestine Payne and Charlie Pincham received life, and Wendy Payne received 28 years. To solve some homicides, investigators need look no further than the victim's own home. But just because a suspect is a relative doesn't mean the case will be solved with relative ease. A killer in the home will take greater care to cover his tracks. It's up to forensics to make sure that deadly secrets don't stay buried in family plots.